Okay, maybe one more minute. We're going to start. So I'll just give you a little kind of an encouragement. If you find there's any food after the talk, we have plastic bags. So just please take things with you. It's for me. I don't know what it is. My father, I know what it is. My father was born the day after the stock market crashed in 1929, and we wasted nothing in my home. So, you know what I mean? So like, please extend the goods. And really enjoy it for later too, like a little midnight snack. I never hurt anybody, I don't think. Folks are coming in. I think we can start. I do want to kind of just bring us together in a kind of a posture of prayer and reflection to think about, I think one of the truest, freest people I've ever, and I actually had the chance to meet him, but I think he's met everybody. And I'm speaking about Pope Francis. And I want to offer a prayer tonight as the healing prayer. He has a kind of a complex lung infection. We hear he's doing okay, but he's an older man. And so just if we would just take a little quiet moment here and pray for and with and think on Pope Francis. Amen. Welcome to the Hank Center event here at Loyola Chicago. Michael Murphy, really glad to see you, and thanks for making time, especially on a cold winter's night. Just really glad to see you. Here's our good friend Connor. He used to work for the center, and I don't mean to embarrass you, Connor, but good to see you. Yeah, please tell us about yourself, Connor. No. It makes me think about the hospitality, so I want to thank our center manager right off the bat, Katie Arnold, and our three intrepid undergraduates, Matthew, who's new, and Emily, who's new, and then Vince, who's been here. But thanks for your labors, everybody, for getting everything going, and thanks, Emily, appreciate it. Make sure you get yourself a little saint keychain on the way out of here. We believe in hospitality, and I'm glad our staff is showing it always. We always do. This is the St. John Henry Newman Lecture, and the series is named after the great 19th century English prelate who wrote so very movingly about his intellectual journey toward Roman Catholicism in his spiritual autobiography called Apologia Pro Vita Sua from 1864. Newman's work helped later generations of Catholics and Catholic converts map out ways to understand the intellectual stakes of religious faith in light of contemporary issues facing modern life. It's interesting, right, to come to kind of something through the mind. For Newman, though, it wouldn't be through just the mind because it's a holism, but it really was, a lot of arguments, and he thought this was the best argument, and he thought about it a lot there in the 19th century, especially in Oxford. So in honoring this kind of engagement with the Catholic tradition, a living tradition, the Hank Center invites scholars each spring to recount their own discovery or rediscovery of the Catholic intellectual heritage in light of their ongoing scholarship and reflection and experience as a person of faith living and navigating the complicated 21st century. So often these scholars, just like Newman, value the fullness of our lives in God, the great gift of being a scholar, and the invitation to engage things that matter, just like Newman did. In a way where, for Newman, there was a Latin phrase, cor ad cor loquitur. He was heart speaking to heart. So mind can speak to mind, and we can debate and argue, and we get a lot of that, and it's important. But really, when you get down to it, it's really like person to person and sharing, heart speaking to heart. And to me, this is what always endears me to Newman. Not only his superb intellect and his interdisciplinary range and chops, he was a theologian, he was a teacher, great preacher, a homilist, a sermonizer. He was a great poet, a great novel. He wrote a novel, too, I think. He was an administrator. What a great bundle God gave him. But he was first and last a person of the heart. There's a cause for him to be doctor of the church. There are like 37, 36 doctors of the church. And we think Newman is going to be a doctor of the church, which means he has a unique understanding of what the church is doing and teaches in that way. Docere or doxilitas means doctor, means to teach, essentially. Abigail Favale, Professor Dr. Abigail Favale, is a lot like Newman. I know that might embarrass her, but she's has wide-ranging talents. She's a writer and professor whose work lies at the intersection of Catholic theology, literature, and women's studies. Her abiding interest as a writer and scholar is the meaning and dignity of woman, and her work explores sexual difference and embodiment in the Catholic imagination. Her first book, Irigere, Luce Irigere, French woman, excellent. The title was Irigere, Incarnation and Contemporary Women's Fiction from Paul Gray, was awarded the 2014 Feminist and Women's Studies Association Book Award. Her first book, so right out of the gate. Abigail's most recent book, The Genesis of Gender, A Christian Theory, was published in 2022 and has already been translated into multiple languages. That book's hitting book clubs by storm. Really, it really is, and really just to kind of like get the topic out there in a fullness that not is usually there. Those can come up tonight. You can ask questions about that. But we have her second book, really, from 2018 that occasions the invitation, and that is Into the Deep in an Unlikely Catholic Conversion from Cascade in 2018. This is a spiritual memoir that traces Abigail's journey from birthright evangelicalism to postmodern feminism, and finally to the Catholic Church. Something to hear. Abigail writes a lot. She's working on a book right now, but she also writes essays, and these essays have appeared in numerous, various kinds of variegated journals. So from Church Life Journal, the great journal of Notre Dame, The Atlantic, First Things, Public Discourse, Comment, and elsewhere. And Abigail is also a fiction writer, like Newman, and was awarded the J.F. Powers Prize for short fiction in 2017. It's our deep honor to have Abigail here, and please help me to welcome her to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, hold on. Let me get oriented here in Command Central. There's a lot going on this podium. Okay. All right, well, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for coming out on this freezing night. I don't know that I personally would have made that choice, so I'm very happy that you did. And I'm here to share my story with you, my conversion story. I became Catholic almost 11 years ago, but it took about a year or two for the conversion to really take, for a new worldview to unfold and replace my old one. I was raised Christian, an evangelical Protestant, but the most difficult issues I wrestled with during my conversion were not the typical Protestant objections, like the Pope and, Mary. They were the feminist ones, right? An all-male priesthood, contraception, abortion, gay marriage. Those were the things that I really struggled with. You see, I was coming to Catholicism from an atypical road, which I'll just call, for simplicity's sake, postmodern feminism. And I'll get into exactly what I mean by that a little bit later. But to give just a kind of illustration of how radical a leap this was, I'll start with this anecdote. So in the summer of 2012, I was sick as a dog, laid out on the couch in the throes of my first pregnancy. And I was reading and kind of watching footage of, or coverage of the controversy surrounding the contraception mandate in the Affordable Care Act. That was kind of what was happening at the time. And I remember looking at these photos of these male Catholic priests testifying against the mandate in their prim white collars and just feeling enraged that they would have the audacity to tell women what they should or shouldn't do with their bodies. Well, less than 2 years later, I was standing in front of such a priest in his full Easter vestments and saying aloud these words: "I believe and profess all that the Holy Catholic Church believes, teaches, and proclaims to be revealed by God." So how the hell did I get there? How did I go from being a committed professional academic feminist, an expert in postmodern gender and feminist theory, to a Catholic, a Roman Catholic — it sounds worse if you say Roman for some reason — who not only loves the church, but embraces all that she teaches? It's a weird story, and I can't tell all of it here, but I want to share with you one central thread of it. Namely, the wisdom, the bounty that I discovered in the Catholic tradition about the goodness of being a woman, the goodness of having and being a body. I became feminist in the first place because of a deeply felt desire to have my dignity as a woman specifically affirmed. And surprisingly, what I sought in feminism was ultimately fulfilled in Catholicism. And I was only able to learn to see that wisdom and to let that wisdom reshape my life by moving from a posture of suspicion to surrender. So, let me tell you that story. I'll start by telling where I came from and what drew me to feminism in the first place. So, I grew up evangelical, like I mentioned, in the Mountain West, in the Mormon Belt, that kind of vertical swath through Utah and eastern Idaho. So I lived in like this little evangelical bubble inside a Mormon bubble. It was kind of like a Russian nesting doll of religious conservatism. And there were some good things about that upbringing. You know, I inherited a simple but very sincere faith, a love for Jesus, and a desire to give him my heart. And my childhood was immersed in the weird and wonderful world of Scripture. I devoured Bible stories, the weirder the better. And I especially love stories of women in the Old Testament, like Jezebel, Jael, Ruth, Esther. Unfortunately, I was a Protestant. I didn't have access to Judith. My child self would have loved that story. And even now, I feel like Scripture is just baked into my bones. You know, these stories continue to shape my imagination, and so I'm very grateful to my upbringing for that gift. There were, however, some not-so-good things. Beyond my own voracious reading, women's stories and voices were not featured much at all. In the churches of my youth, the sermon, of course, was the centerpiece of the service. And I never heard a sermon about a woman. Despite the ample and really interesting biblical material for such a sermon, I never saw a woman in any kind of leadership or teaching role within the church. There weren't even any prominent images of women, you know, aside from like a brief cameo of Mary in Christmas nativity scene. And any talk of certain Christian virtues like obedience and submission were highly gendered, as if these virtues were kind of reserved for women and typically framed in relation to men rather than to God. This was also the late 80s and 90s, so there was this anxious emphasis on purity, especially for young women. And this was a very reductive, sexualized understanding of purity, not the scriptural vision of purity as this kind of holistic kind of holiness that you develop over time in response and cooperation with God's grace. But this was purity as the absence of sexual activity. So it's something you have by default, and then with one misstep, you can lose permanently. Which, spoiler alert, I did. And after that misstep, according to the messages I received from my church community, as well as my family, I'd lost my value and worth as a woman. I was damaged goods. So it was in this state of shame and apparent worthlessness that I went to college. You know, what a great time to go to college when you're feeling terrible about yourself. And I quickly embraced feminism. This feminist awakening was pretty swift. So my freshman year, you know, I went in holding conventional evangelical opinions about women. And by my second semester, I was writing a term paper entitled God is a Feminist and like emailing it to my parents. So the catalyst for this swerve was a moment in my New Testament class, and we were discussing 1 Corinthians. And my attention was really drawn to this one particular verse, 1 Corinthians 11:7, which states that something like man is the image and glory of God, and woman is the image and glory of man. And so I was like, well, what does this mean? It seems to imply this kind of hierarchy of value, you know, placing all men in greater proximity and likeness to God. And so I asked my professor about this, and he just did kind of it's an awkward duck and roll, and switched the topic to something less volatile. And so I took my question to that ancient pre-Google oracle known as a library. And in its hallowed halls, I discovered feminist biblical criticism and feminist theology. and I was all in. And at first, this turn toward feminism had a positive effect on my faith. It restored a sense of my own dignity and worth, and I learned to undo and untangle some of the harmful beliefs I'd inherited about women. And around this same time, I began attending a small Anglican church and encountered for the first time female saints and Mary and an embodied liturgical form of worship. Catholicism was kind of beckoning from afar, but I just couldn't get past the idea of an all-male priesthood. Anglicanism seemed like Catholicism's woke younger sister. I could keep all the perks without the patriarchal baggage. And for a while, this worked. I was a good Anglican. I went to Oxford for a semester and studied Julian of Norwich and Hildegard of Bingen and attended evensong every day. But after this seeming golden era, when my Christianity and feminism were pretty seamlessly entwined, there was a shift. And feminist theory, rather than Christian revelation, became my primary lens. I was no longer incorporating feminist ideals into a Christian worldview. Instead, feminism was my worldview. And I began to look at Christianity from a distance, askance. I remember saying to my Anglican priest and spiritual director at the time that I felt alienated from God, like God had become hidden behind this big stone wall. And we both concluded that the wall must be patriarchy. But the problem with that theory, in retrospect, is that it didn't really fit the data. After all, this was a moment when my Christian beliefs and practices were the most feminist they'd ever been. In fact, I'd recently rewritten the Our Father as the Our Mother for use in our little Anglican home church. And the truth then is actually this. It's when I started to pray to God as Mother that I lost the desire to pray at all. And for the next 10 years, I didn't. I went off to graduate school and more or less stopped practicing Christianity altogether. A worldview. So why did this shift happen? That's kind of the question I want to chase for a little bit. Why did my feminist worldview seem to eventually lead me away from my faith? Well, a worldview, in essence, is a way of seeing. It's a way of reading, you might say, of interpreting reality and all its many facets. And as a feminist, I adopted a certain mode of interpretation that is called a hermeneutics of suspicion. A hermeneutics is a way of reading. So it's an orientation or kind of posture of reading with suspicion. So I was trained and thus primed to analyze every text, every interaction, every argument with an eye toward finding the underlying patriarchal bias at work. Now, what might be a helpful tool at times, an occasionally handy methodology, became for me a totalizing way of seeing. I became deeply suspicious of God, of Scripture, of Christian tradition and history. I learned to see all of these things as thoroughly corrupted by patriarchy, as human, specifically man-made, constructs rather than divine revelation. Well, let me let you in on a little secret. It's really hard to love God if you are suspicious of him. In this period of my life, my years in graduate school and early academia, I was immersed in postmodern or post-structuralist feminist theory. I was studying figures such as Luce Irigaray, Hélène Cixous, and Judith Butler. And so I learned to see reality as completely socially and linguistically constructed. All stories, all meta-narratives, even and probably especially Christianity, are collective human efforts at meaning-making and nothing more. During those years, I loosely held on to an anemic belief in some higher divine reality out there somewhere. But this was a reality that did not speak. God was not a self-disclosing being, breaking into our world through words and images and the incarnation to reveal himself. God was a metaphor, a story, crafted by humans in an attempt to explain the unexplainable, to know what is unknowable. A worldview like this precludes the possibility of divine grace. And by divine grace, I mean divine action in the world. It precludes the possibility of divine revelation. And I had completely by then abandoned any notion of authoritative divine revelation, a standard of truth to which I was beholden. And so everything was up for grabs. Right? If I didn't like a particular portion of scripture or an aspect of Christian tradition, I could reject it, revise it. And in this way, I crafted a very affirming version of Christianity for myself, one that enthusiastically high-fived all my choices and opinions, one that asked very little of me, and therefore could offer no real transformation. I no longer saw myself as in need of redemption. It was Christianity that needed saving, and I was the enlightened prophet sent by me to do just that. It was like Christianity had become a lovely bouquet of cut flowers, blooms that had been severed from their roots and could be endlessly rearranged. Well, cut flowers are beautiful, but they don't live very long. And so it was with my faith. In this era of my life, it dwindled away to almost nothing. So that's where I was by the end of my 20s. I was in a state of escalating spiritual crisis, and things quickly came to a head. At the beginning of October 2013, I was a disaffected, angsty, post-Christian feminist on the brink of atheism. And by the end of the month, I was on the phone with a Mexican nun asking about joining the Catholic Church. So what peaked in that single month was a perfect storm of two colliding crises. First, a spiritual crisis. That semester in one of my literature classes, I had been teaching some Flannery O'Connor, which is always a dangerous thing to do. And I became haunted by this anecdote that she shares about attending a dinner party with a friend who described the Eucharist as a pretty good symbol. Flannery's response, which is well known to many of you, I'm sure, but it was totally new to me at the time, was this: well, if it's just a symbol, to hell with it. And that line, those 9 little words, just wriggled under my skin and poked at me. After all, at that time in my life, I saw not just the Eucharist, but the whole of Christianity as, at best, a pretty good symbol. I was teaching at a Christian college at the time, and still telling myself and others that I was a practicing Christian. But I'd reduced Christianity to this nexus of compelling metaphors that connected only to other metaphors, like a house of mirrors. And with that one sentence from Flannery, my pseudo-Christianity was unmasked for what it was. If it's just a symbol, to hell with it. And I began to see all my precious, postmodern equivocation was just a bunch of bullshit. But in the midst of this spiritual crisis, I wasn't sure where to turn because, plot twist, my feminism was also, for the first time, in a state of upheaval. This is the second thunderhead of that perfect storm. My feminist crisis that was brought on by my life-altering encounter with motherhood. In late 2012, I became a mother for the first time. And in the experiences of pregnancy and childbirth and lactation, I experienced, you might say, my femaleness fully activated. And I realized, well, femaleness is also not just a symbol, not a mere construct. Sexual difference, it turns out, is real and profoundly shapes our lives in ways that I'd become blind to. I also became a mother to a son, which is not quite what I expected. I thought I would have a very feminist pregnancy and give birth to a girl and name her Gloria Steinem. But, God had other plans. And this tiny, beautiful boy opened my heart in new ways to the world of boys and men. And I became interested in their experiences, their joys and struggles. So after undergoing the strange alchemy of motherhood, the prime feminist value of autonomy no longer had as much explanatory power in my life. Feminism no longer spoke as meaningfully to my experience. And I became much more aware of feminism's longstanding ambivalence toward motherhood and female fertility. I was also aware, in a new way, of how my own humanity is deeply interconnected with the humanity of others, not simply in networks of oppression, but in networks of love. Pregnancy, perhaps, is the most potent symbol of what is true about all of us. We are interdependent beings. And I began to see this interconnection not as a threat to my freedom, but as something beautiful and holy. Now, in the midst of these escalating twin crises, I struck upon a solution for my angst. I just needed to find a job at a Catholic university. And the reasoning for this, I don't know, might make you laugh, might make you feel depressed, maybe both. But here was my reasoning. I had to be honest that I could no longer in good faith present myself as a Christian professor at a creedal Christian university. But I wasn't totally ready for a completely secular environment where questions of faith are completely off the table. So I thought, well, I'll go to a Catholic college where I don't have to profess any actual belief. What was actually happening is that the longing I'd felt toward Catholicism years ago was resurfacing, seemingly out of nowhere. It was still there, buried under layers of hardened suspicion, layers that had apparently begun to thaw. And this all came to a head in one moment. I was sitting in my office on campus at my desk. It was a late October afternoon. I'd just sent 2 emails withdrawing job applications to 2 Catholic universities. I'd reached the wise decision that I shouldn't uproot my family just because I'm having an existential crisis. And as I sat there, staring at my open laptop, a thought came to me. And it wasn't from within me. It wasn't like it surfaced in my own mind. It entered from outside, like a bird flying through an open window. And this was the thought. You don't have to work at a Catholic university to be part of the Catholic Church. And right then and there, possessed by some strange impulse, I Googled the phone number for the local Catholic parish. I called it up. Someone answered, that's the real miracle. And I heard myself saying preposterous, impossible words that I could not believe were exiting my mouth. I think I might be interested in learning more about joining the Catholic Church. And that woman who answered was Sister Juanita, a 70-year-old Mexican nun who just happened to be leading our CIA. Come to the church, she said, right now. And I did. That was October 2013, and I entered the church during Easter, several months later on April 19th, 2014. That, however, is not the end of my conversion story. Joining the Catholic Church was the catalyst for a profound inner conversion. It was not the culmination. It was not the result of a conversion. I joined the church with many unresolved questions. I was still holding the church at arm's length, not yet belonging fully to her. So this second act of the story, this internal conversion, it's complex, it's multifaceted, it unfolded over a period of 1 to 2 years. I can't map out that whole story for you tonight. I did write a book about it, though, if you're interested. But I do want to highlight 2 aspects of that inner conversion, this initiation into a new way of seeing. The first is the what. What was this new way of seeing? What did I begin to see? And the second is the how. How did I begin to see it? So let's start with the what. The startling illumination that resolved my hardest questions, my deepest objections, a restoration of a sacramental vision of reality, which I like to call a cosmos, a sacramental cosmos. As I mentioned earlier, in my postmodern feminist understanding, all of reality was constructed by human-made signs and symbols. But in the Catholic understanding, the visible world is sacramental. Those signs and symbols make known the invisible reality of God. And the grace of God that is active and alive in the world elevates those signs to sacraments. The world, even and especially our bodies, are sacred signs, living icons that reveal the reality of a loving God, a God who is seeking to make himself known. And one of the central metaphors that God discloses to us is the nuptial metaphor. We are Christ's bride, meant for eternal union with him. That verse in 1 Corinthians that sparked my feminist awakening reads totally differently in the light of a sacramental cosmos. That verse is about the nuptial metaphor, in which man is a distant icon of God in relation to humankind, and woman is the image of humankind in relation to God. Now, this is not a totalizing metaphor and should not be read too literally as a deification of male humans. No, it's a metaphor of the relation, of divine human communion, with each sex evoking the union from a distinct angle. And as a woman, I participate in that sacred meaning. I carry it, not by doing or accomplishing something, but simply by being, by allowing my body to speak its own silent language. In feminist theory, what unites all women is a common experience of oppression. And there are seeds of truth to that account, to be sure. But it provides a fundamentally negative ground for female identity, one that raises some quandaries. If feminism achieves its goals and solves the problem of oppression, will women cease to exist? But a Catholic way of seeing gave me a positive and substantial understanding of womanhood as both a natural and sacramental reality. This is what ultimately resolved my objections to the male priesthood. The Mass is a liturgical drama, a staging of the nuptial wedding feast. And the priest's male body in that context serves an iconic function as the bridegroom. And to dismiss or deny that iconic meaning, to say it doesn't matter, is to deny the iconography of my own body, the sacred language that femaleness can speak. The Catholic way of seeing illuminated for me the sacred dignity of both male and female embodiment. Here's how I describe it in my conversion memoir. When I look back at my evangelical upbringing, it's as if the feminine aspects of the faith have been lopped off. There's no Mary, no genealogy of heroic female saints, no visible church as our mother, no Mass with the iconography of bridegroom and bride, no sacramental understanding of our bodies as sacred signs. I rightly sensed that something was amiss in that version of Christianity, that it was too monolithically masculine, that anything feminine was sidelined and relegated. In that religious context, the masculine metaphors, in isolation from their feminine counterparts, were harsh and unremitting, like banging out a melody using only the lower keys on a piano. The Catholic sacramental cosmos restores, in its fullness, the masculine and feminine modes of being human and the fruitful synergy that is possible between them. This, then, is the what that I began to see. All of reality in a sacramental light. But how did I enter into this new way of seeing? This happened not by reading a persuasive text or being compelled by intellectual argument, at least not completely or first and foremost. This happened first and foremost by praying a dangerous prayer. Like I mentioned, I entered the church in a state of dissonance. I was still carrying major questions related to the male priesthood, contraception, and same-sex marriage. And I was willing to suspend these objections and take a leap into the church, but I had not yet fully resolved them. And to be honest, I didn't necessarily expect to. Catholic tradition, after all, has a high view of conscience. And my preliminary reading about conscience had led me to the conclusion that dissent with church teaching is permissible, as I'm bound to follow the dictates of my conscience. I saw in this view of conscience something like a legal loophole, a way to follow the church without actually following her. This interest in conscience led me to the work of John Henry Newman. I had heard, after all, of his famous quip about offering a toast to the Pope, yes, but conscience first. I came across one of his sermons entitled The Testimony of Conscience. I thought, well, that sounds promising. But what I found in that sermon was not what I sought. I did not find self-gratifying nuggets about conscientious objections to church teaching. I found instead a profound anatomy of conversion, especially its interior dimensions. Here's a little excerpt from that sermon. But when a man comes to God to be saved, then I say, the essence of true conversion is a surrender of himself, an unreserved, unconditional surrender. And this is a saying which most men and women who come to God cannot receive. They wish to be saved, but in their own way. They wish, as it were, to capitulate upon terms, to carry off their goods with them. Whereas the true spirit of faith leads a man to look off from self to God, to think nothing of his own wishes, his present habits, his importance or dignity, his rights, his opinions, but to say, I put myself in thy hands, O Lord. Make me what thou wilt. I forget myself. I divorce myself from myself. I am dead to myself. I will follow thee. As it turns out, this sermon was not about the importance of following one's conscience, but about forming it. Newman's words did not give me a pass, an excuse to defer to my own authority. They instead contained a twofold call. A call away from a flimsy, self-congratulatory understanding of conscience as simply my own cherished and long-held opinions, and a call toward a radical surrender of those very opinions, indeed of my whole self, in order to be renewed in the truth. But even more important than this understanding of inner renewal, embedded in this sermon was a prayer of conversion, a prayer of self-surrender. I copied this prayer into my journal, and in my first Lent as a Catholic, almost a full year after I'd entered the church, I began to pray this prayer every night by candlelight. This is the prayer. I sacrifice to thee this cherished wish, this lust, this weakness, this scheme, this opinion. Make me what thou wouldst have me. I bargain for nothing, I make no terms. I seek for no previous information whither thou art taking me. I will be what thou wilt make me, and all that thou wilt make me. I say not, I will follow thee whithersoever thou goest, for I am weak. But I give myself to thee, to lead me anywhither. I will follow thee in the dark, only begging thee to give me strength according to my day. Try me, O Lord, and seek the ground of my heart. Prove me and examine my thoughts. Look well if there be any way of wickedness in me. Search each dark recess with thine own bright light, and lead me in the way everlasting. I prayed that prayer. I also prayed the prayer of Bartimaeus the blind man, which is much shorter, from the Gospel of Mark. Domine ut videum, O Lord, I want to see. And over the course of several months, while praying these prayers, and also reading and trying to better understand why the church teaches what she does, my worldview, my entire way of seeing was transformed. And in that new light, my objections were resolved. I can't help but love that delicious providential irony. I saw in that sermon a means to avoid changing my cherished beliefs, and instead was given a catalyst by which they were changed. This inner conversion began because I had rediscovered the bedrock spiritual virtue of surrender. Not surrender to another human being, but surrender to God. Without realizing it, the attitude of suspicion that I had adopted, which had become a totalizing lens, had crippled me spiritually. The posture of suspicion, when directed toward God, is the antithesis of the posture of surrender, which is the beginning of the spiritual life. You can see this most clearly in the Annunciation. Mary's fiat is a microcosm of the Christian life for both men and women. She is the epitome of the human person's greatest power, the ability to say yes to God and let his grace take root in us, bear fruit in us. I learned to read through feminist theory Mary's yes as something negative, even something oppressive, rather than as the ultimate expression of human freedom. I want to end by just reading a page from my memoir, which captures what I'm trying to say about surrender. These are the dangerous prayers that ransomed my mind and heart. Each of these prayers at its root is a prayer of submission, surrender. Not surrender wrought by violent conquest, but surrender freely given. God is not Orwell's big brother who pummels us into obedience, extracting our love, our devotion, by obliterating our individuality. That is an evil inversion of the Trinitarian love that woos us with grace, but never compromises our freedom, and that wants nothing other than to make us fully ourselves, fully alive. This is surrender as trust, the way a bird trusts the wind. Surrender as yes, I will, yes. For years, my feminist convictions led me to resist the idea of submission. It was a dirty word, one to be rejected, rewritten. And to be fair, in my religious upbringing, the word submission was mostly trotted out as a scriptural mandate that wives should submit to their husbands. And this was interpreted in a one-sided way, and often broadened to mean the general submission of men, or women, to men in all spheres, Freudian slip. The corresponding verses that demand self-sacrifice from husbands and mutual submission between all believers were rarely brought to the foreground. Submission, then, was a bludgeon word used against women, and in that limited sense, the feminist is right to resist it. But rather than trying to understand the wider scriptural meaning of submission, I jettisoned the idea altogether, and in doing so, I hobbled myself spiritually. I chose instead a path of arrogance and self-rule. If after my feminist awakening I felt as if God were disappearing behind a wall, I now know that the wall was not patriarchy, it was my own hardened will. In truth, surrender should be the spiritual posture of every Christian. Receptivity, obedience, these are not weaker, delicate traits best left to the ladies. These are the lifeblood of spiritual vitality. In Mary's yes to God that broke open our world, her yes that became an eternal bridge between God and mankind, in this self-abandonment to the divine will, we find the pinnacle of human becoming, the perfect response of creature to creator. This surrendering of the will does not obliterate it, making us into some kind of automaton. No, it sharpens it, heightens it, by redirecting it toward the good, the beautiful, and the true. This was the first of many paradoxes that I encountered in my Catholic conversion, the first of many exquisite surprises. I discovered spiritual life and true freedom by surrendering to a patient love beyond myself, by offering up my will and desires in prayer, night by night, at the inner altar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abby. It was so nourishing and exquisite. You know, St. John Henry Newman wrote a very famous book called The Idea of University, and reminding the reader, the thinker, that there is no topic off the table at a true university, including the depths of theology. Still, though, these are very, can be challenging. There's, faith has its own intellectual epistemology, and, there's the culture is very dominant, and these can be challenging things. You lived it, Abby, so, but maybe there's lots of ways to respond here. So I know, but know this is, to be perfectly blunt, a very safe space for any comment, any question, done in earnest, charitable goodwill. This is what the university is for. So please feel free to ask or comment anything, and just raise your hand, and Katie's has a mic over there, I have a mic over here. We're ready to hear your comments and questions.
Hi, and thank you for the talk. It was very beautiful, very inspiring. You mentioned how you saw your conversion to Catholicism initially as not the fruit of your conversion, but in some ways the seed of it, and as surrender as something coming after.
Yeah.
But you do speak about a suspension of disbelief in some capacity, and you're assenting to the church even when you didn't listen to every teaching. So I'm wondering what pushed you over the edge to make you willing to enter the Catholic Church in the first place.
Yeah. Well, as soon as I went to the parish and talked to Sister Juanita, and it's weird to think about it now because I was like, it was a surreal moment because I heard myself saying things that I just couldn't. I lived in cognitive dissonance for so long. But what happened when I took that initial step was just this like flood tide of desire. Like I was just spiritually starved, really. And I felt this, especially this very acute longing for the Eucharist. And so that, I was willing to suspend my objections and to join the church. And I think for me, I think about this a lot too. For me, I don't think I could have understood, that like sacramental understanding of reality from outside the church. I had to enter into it and to be nourished by the sacraments to see it. I mean, that's another piece of this, right? I focused on the prayer in this particular talk, but I was also taking the sacraments. I was also living the sacramental life for the first time. And so that was also part of the change. But it was just this longing for the Eucharist and experiencing spiritual consolation after, just desolation for a long time. God was very generous with me. He was giving me the sweet milk at that time, and kind of pulled it back later. But that's what got me in initially, yeah.
I'm curious as to how, like, when you were borderline atheist, as you put it, how did that affect, like, your home life with your husband and your kids? And since you had, like, such a strong stance on, like, socially concepted feminism and how that has changed, like, how it was versus how it is now.
Yeah, I didn't really talk about my marriage at all in this talk. So my husband was an atheist. Like, he was more intellectually honest than I was. Like, we were both raised evangelical. And when he, instead of like living in this kind of weird space, like it's just a pretty story or whatever, he was like, if it's not true, then to hell with it, right? That's kind of what he, which I again, I think was a little more intellectually honest than I was. So at the time, my husband and I neither of us were practicing Christians. We didn't go to church. So it was when I became Catholic that things got weird. And that was, he was super supportive, as supportive as you could be. But for the first time in our marriage, we were like starting to see things very differently. And that was very much a source of suffering, like not to be kind of on the same page like we had been before. And of course, we were also becoming parents for the first time, which raises complicated questions about how are you going to raise your kid, right? It's one thing if there's just the two of you. It's like, okay, yeah, you go to Mass on Sunday, I'll see you afterwards, But when it comes to questions of how are we going to raise our kid, are we going to baptize, etc. So that was really tricky at first. My husband has since become Catholic, and his conversion was very different than mine. And I was very impatient about it, and God, it took a while for me to learn I had to just get out of the way and let God do it. God was doing this slow dance in Michael's heart, and I was just getting in the way. But yeah, so that it was actually disruptive to the marriage for me to become Catholic, but in a way that, of course, like eventually, there's also really good fruit from it that became transformative for both of us in the end. So, yeah.
This side?
Hi, so thank you so much for your talk. I have a question about, well, I just want to preface this by saying, like, I hope it's okay if I ask about, like, the detail of your conversion story. I mean, it's, like, a very, like, personal thing to share, so I don't want to, like, trod on your self-concept or anything like this by asking this question.
Okay, let's hear
No, sorry.
I don't want to devastate you by what I'm about to say.
No,
I'm just joking. You're
that
totally
was
fine.
vastly exaggerated.
You're totally fine.
the question is just about the like status of rational argument or reason in your conversion,
yeah.
because I was honestly like a little surprised that at the end of your talk you went into the virtue of submission so deeply, because earlier in your talk, and also based on some of your writings that I read, like the shorter stuff in Church Life Journal, it seemed to me that like certain experiences that you had as a mother, for example, which you talked about, sort of intellectually motivated you to rethink what you called like post-structuralist feminism,
Yeah.
and so there did seem to be like a rational element to it,
Yeah.
and I'm just wondering if you could say more about
Yes.
how you see those two things fitting together.
Yeah, for sure there was an intellectual, I mean, I remember actually once saying to Sister Juanita, like, I was like, so do you have like, I don't know, some encyclicals I could read or something? And she was like, you don't need to read more, you need to pray more. And I was like, okay, which was true. I think because I was, yeah. I mean, I think because, I don't know, I'm an intellectual, but like I am an intellectual. And so I was already primed to do that. And so I was reading a lot at the time. But I really think it was the prayer that taught me how to receive from God. And so then the intellectual work that I was doing became more fruitful, right? Because I think I was much more defensive going into it. And so that's why I really focused on the prayer, because I think that yeah, that's what made the intellectual work fruitful. Because I was like reading a ton at the time. You know, I was really wrestling with these questions. But something shifted to where the way I was approaching the intellectual work was, okay, I want to understand why the church teaches what she does, without the expectation that I would agree with it, right? Which I think was helpful. You know, I never had this attitude like, I have to force myself to agree with the church. I never had that attitude. And I was honestly surprised when I began to agree with the church. I was kind of surprised when the pieces began to fall into place. I was surprised that there were actually good answers for the questions that I had. But I really think that if it wasn't also for that, like what I was learning in prayer about how to even just have the right spiritual posture for conversion, like to learn how to say yes to God in a way that I hadn't in years. Like that was like the bedrock of it, you know? Yeah.
How has your experience as a mother, a wife, and just like a woman in general, and your posture, like towards that, informed your perspective about like the church and like how we are to act and like what our mission is as part of her body?
That's a great question. It's hard to give a short answer to that question because I feel like I've learned so much and am learning so much all the time. I mean, I think becoming a mother really broke me out of myself in a way that I really needed to be reshaped, like, and kind of broken out of myself, right? Because, and this isn't the only way that this can happen, right? There are, you know, people who don't get married or never have kids, and God still works on them in this way. But for me, this has really been the school of sanctification in a way, because I think it very much reconciled me with my femaleness in a certain way. I began to feel, and not in a romantic way, like I don't have glamorous pregnancies. Like I'm pregnant right now and I'm like miserable most of the time, right? Like it's not fun. But I don't think nothing I've experienced has been a better teacher of the redemptive power of suffering than pregnancy and motherhood, right? And to actually see and experience like the fruit, like the wonderful fruit that suffering can bring when it is productive. And I think about that a lot, about childbirth and pregnancy as almost a way to understand the mystery of redemptive suffering. So that's just like one little thing, I would say. But yeah, it's hard to like succinctly answer that question because it's such a big one.
That's great. Right over here, how about Bronwyn and then, yeah.
Thank you so much. It's very moving to hear your story straight from you. I'm interested, you're now one of several very interesting, very intelligent people I know for whom Newman played an important role in bringing them into the church. And I'm curious, you described your interaction with his, the writing on conscience. I'm curious, I have two questions. One, did you struggle with him for a bit, or was it very quick? Like, did he sort of win you over quickly, or were you sort of like battling with him a little bit? And then the second question is, after that point in your life where he played this seemingly crucial role, has he remained with you as a guide on certain other matters?
Yeah, I think I don't totally know I think this was first where I actually tried to read the Pro Vita Paula, yeah. And I was like, I didn't quite take. I think it's because like my first impulse was like to hyper intellectualize this thing, right? So what I think is sort of ironic, I guess, a little bit, that what I got from Newman was actually much more about like the disposition of the heart. And so that prayer, I still pray that prayer, especially when I start to feel like my heart turn into a husk again, which it does periodically about this time of year, usually. And I just find it such a fruitful prayer. And so just because of that, I do feel this affinity with him, even though, and I did try to read his fiction too, and I was just like, oh, I don't know about this. Yeah. So I would say, I haven't done like a huge deep dive into all of Newman's work. Like some of it I don't really connect with, to be honest. But this particular sermon and this particular prayer, I'm very much connected with. And also just his story, as a whole. So he is definitely someone I admire. Yeah.
Over there and then over here. Okay, thank you. We didn't say about identifying yourself. Is that important to people? Sometimes. We'll start now. What's your name? Where are you from?
I'm Jacqueline Webster, and I'm from Petoskey, Michigan. When you said when you're suspicious of God, it's really hard to love him, that stood out to me a lot. I've been thinking about that a lot this week. How did you get past that? Was it through prayer, as you've mentioned? Do you have a specific advice for that?
Yeah, the way I got past it, I think it's not so much like prayer, because sometimes I think if you like pray, you can almost think about prayer as this like really effortful exertion, like this thing you're doing and trying to force or something, which I think for me it was really about like just entering into a different relation to God and no longer seeing myself as the primary authority. But, having... So part of that, I guess, was a shifting view of myself, too, like seeing myself as smaller and in need of illumination from God. A big part of it, too, for me has been, my spirituality is very Marian. So a big part of it for me has been trying, especially the moment of the Annunciation. I have a big devotion to the Annunciation. And so contemplating the Annunciation is very impactful for me. The Marian consecration has been very impactful for me. So I feel like very early on, God kind of put me on this path of like this Marian path of following the faith. And so I feel like I'm learning that from her, if that makes sense.
That's great. I think about maybe 10 minutes, which I think is 3 more questions or interventions, and then some social time. Did you want to say who you are?
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. I'm Roxy. I'm from Chicago.
Did we meet at
Yeah,
Montreal?
we did
Yeah,
meet.
yeah. Okay,
we
that's
met
what
at the
I thought.
Willows. Yeah. About the verse that you brought up from Corinthians,
Uh-huh.
like man is the glory. I'm sorry. man is the glory of God and woman is the glory of man. How did you reconcile that with, what you learned in feminism and also Catholicism as well? Or how do you interpret that verse?
Well, part of the problem is that I think I had been taught to read the Bible, as an evangelical, I've been taught to read the Bible in a very, like, isolated way. Like, you like, each verse almost, like, stands alone in a way. And so I was, like, super honing on that verse. And so it has to be read in the context of a whole interpretive tradition, right, that tells us, like, how to read the Bible. But when I read it now, I think that whole passage, I think Paul is developing his understanding of the nuptial metaphor that he really sets out in Ephesians 5. There's also discussion about, like, whether women should cover their heads or not in that particular passage. And the way I interpret it is that he's talking about this practice as a way of symbolically gesturing toward that nuptial metaphor. And so when he says that man is the image of God and woman is the image of man, in that metaphor, that's how the metaphor is, like, being staged, right? That the man represents God in relation to humankind, and that the woman, when we're talking about that metaphor, represents humankind in relation to God, right? So that's how I read it now. And so in isolation, it sounds as if it's saying, like, women aren't in the image of God or something, but you can't read it that way, because that would be just like cherry picking it out of the context of all of Scripture, where women are very much made in the image of God as well. But so, yeah, I think that passage is kind of grounded in his reading of the nuptial metaphor. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Mara. I'm over here. Hi, I just had a quick question. So I feel like in a lot of books and just like things that you see online, a lot of intellectuals who come to faith tend to go towards more of like a Protestant way after learning like the historical facts about the Bible and maybe turning to faith that way. And so I'm curious what it was that specifically led you to Catholicism. Was it the literature about the Eucharist, or was it your upbringing, or what led you there as your way to faith?
I mean, I think what initially drew me was much more a more kind of visceral attraction to the incarnational beauty of the Catholic tradition. So a more embodied worship, like actually using my body in worship, and the sacraments, receiving God into my very body. I've always loved going into Catholic spaces and just seeing like bodies everywhere, So even when I was in my perhaps most suspicious feminist days, I still loved Catholic churches. And that really weirded me out because I was like, this is supposed to feel like patriarchal in here, but it doesn't. This is beautiful. I don't know what to do about this. So I think it was really kind of the incarnational beauty that initially drew me. But then when I really brought my hardest questions, that's when I experienced like the intellectual heft of the Catholic tradition that actually had really good responses to my questions that surprised me, honestly. I was like, okay, I guess you do have some wisdom to share on these issues, that I wasn't aware of. So, yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Naomi Fisher. Thanks so much for the talk. I just wanted to ask about, you call these prayers dangerous prayers.
Yeah.
And I sympathize with that, right? Like these, to say like, oh yeah, remake me, is frightening. And, and then the fear of the loss of myself in that, right? Like, I'm going to become unrecognizable in this process. And I guess I was wondering if you could talk about how, if those fears were realized, or like, because it sounds like maybe they were in a way, right? Like, yeah, you were remade in ways that maybe you would have found yourself unrecognizable. And what was that like for you? And in that original fear and feeling this is dangerous, and then moving forward with it.
Yeah. I think when I say they're dangerous, I think they're very effective when prayed with a true disposition of heart to, and I love being Catholic. I'm so thankful for my conversion, but it was hard. It was really hard. It was hard because the entire identity, the entire professional identity that I had built, especially in the institution where I was, the reputation I had to let go of all of that. And there were people who were like, understandably really weirded out that I became, like that, you know, like maybe one of the most like progressive feminists on campus, like that's what I was known for, you know, became Catholic. And so I did lose friendships because of that. Not even necessarily in a dramatic way, but in like a very kind of quiet, like they didn't really know what to do with me anymore kind of way, you know? And so at the time, I mean, I really thought that I was kind of committing professional suicide, really. Like I was completely like taking a right turn, like a sudden hairpin turn, the path that I had been following. But I think almost every conversion story I listen to, I feel like anyone who enters the church is like immediately asked to give something up. You know, like you're asked to give up something. For some people, you know, and part of that too was like the kind of stability of my marriage in a way. So it felt very risky at the time. And I didn't know how those things were going to turn out, you know. Turns out they've turned out fine, you know, because, am I in trouble? Because I also think in a lot of, I'm just going to say, yeah, sure, why not? Sorry, we're just powering down. I didn't know what button to push. I just pushed the red one because that's the one you should not push was the one I wanted to push. That's my personality. Okay. Yeah, so I think it was also just so disorienting, you know, to have, but also really invigorating. That's the thing. It's just such a paradox. Because I think one of the biggest gifts early on was clarity. Like I had been in a world, I had inhabited an intellectual world where clarity was not a central value. And I hungered for that. And I hungered for truth again. Not just truth, but like truth, you know. So there were, from the beginning, there were gifts and there were crosses, like from the get-go. Yeah.
Anybody here want to lodge a disputation or a challenge to what you've heard? This is a university and it's honest. Anybody want to? Yeah. Yeah, there's two hands back there. Are you prepared for? Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
We'll do two, then we'll have maybe one more. So I think maybe time for.
Well, I don't think you can challenge someone's personal
Right.
story, so I'm not going to
Sorry.
challenge that. I think it's a beautiful story. I guess the question that might feel challenging would be, do you believe that feminism and Catholicism can be reconciled? So they weren't for you, but can they be for other people who maybe have different experiences?
Yeah, I love this question. I mean, this is a great question. I love this question. I wouldn't say they're not reconciled for me, honestly. I mean, I guess one way to put it is I think feminism and Catholicism are like overlapping Venn diagrams, where there's this kind of central core that is overlapping in the sense that if you want to distill the essence of feminism as a concern for women's dignity and justice for women in the world, with also the belief that there are forces in society that undermine that dignity and cause injustice, I think that as a Catholic, I'm very much concerned about those exact same things. Now, what that looks like, I think that, first of all, there are a lot of different forms of feminism, so it's hard to even totally generalize, but I would say maybe the most predominant feminist narratives are going to be in tension on the church with certain teachings. For example, on abortion would be probably the biggest tension. And so when it comes to points of tension, I see the Catholic teaching as divinely revealed has a weight of authority in those sort of questions. And so I guess you might say that I remain friendly with feminism. When I'm able, I'll call myself a feminist in certain contexts. But I think what's different is that the ground of authority for me used to be feminist theory or feminist whatever. Let's say dogma. My feminist dogma used to be what was unquestioned, and then when there were tensions, I would reject the Christian kind of position. And I would say that's kind of flipped, maybe, to where, for me, I'm approaching feminism from like a very kind of Catholic place, even though I see it as something that should be charitably and seriously engaged with. And I remain very concerned about misogyny in society and in certain sectors of the church. So in that sense, I'm still feminist, but I guess a Catholic primarily, if that makes sense.
I think for a lot of feminists, and I can speak for myself, the grounding in feminism isn't feminist theory, it's experience. And I think experience and Catholicism can go together.
I'm not an expert, but is there one feminism?
No. No, but also I think sometimes you can do the like no true Scotsman sort of thing where it's like you can duck any critique of feminism by saying there's not one feminist. So I think it is possible to generalize about some kind of central core like feminist positions that tend to be predominant. So anyway, that's kind of more what I'm.
Back here, maybe one more, then we'll have brownies.
I don't want to keep you from brownies, so I'll try and be brief. My name's Tim. I'm the Title IX coordinator here at Loyola, and this isn't intended as a challenge per se, but more of kind of a naming of attention that I'm sitting with and feeling, which is first. I'll echo the thoughts that others shared. Thank you for the authenticity and sharing your story. I mean, such a deeply personal story, which all conversion stories and faith journeys are. And so this isn't in any way a critique of your story. But I guess I have a suspicion hair on the back of my neck that comes up when one story is offered, not that you did, but could be offered or understood as a prescription for others, and recognizing that everybody's journey is so very deeply personal and individual. I'm trying to understand how to square some other strongly held values in a Jesuit institution like ours, basic concepts like human dignity for all people, understanding of the totality of the person, the care for the holistic sense of the person, including their own sense of self in the world, et cetera, including their gender identity, which I know you've written about and have thoughts about. And also this idea of discernment, which for Ignatius is a very, very clear, direct line to understanding how God is moving in a person, which I kind of could make a connection to that concept of conscience, maybe a little bit different, but we're told to pay attention to what's going on inside of us and wrestle with that and bring that back to God and pray on that, et cetera. And I'm thinking about the journey of a person who may share different identities, may feel in their internal sense of self this deep sense of being gay, or this deep sense of deeply, truly feeling outside of the expectations or the norms for their biological sex or their sex, right? And trying to think about how to square this sense of interior freedom, which for you came when you let go and surrendered and let go of some of these other deeply held identities that for you were very important, feminist identity, et cetera, progressive, what have you. For someone else, the idea of surrendering to this Catholic anthropology of male and female requires the letting go of this other deeply personal sense of something that's internal, that if they bring it to God and they pray and it's still there and God loves us entirely, how do they get that relief or get to that place of that joyful surrender, that calm that comes with that? That's the tension that I'm kind of just wrestling with. I don't know if there was a question in there so much as just a reflection, and wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all called to this kind of yes. And I think it's scary for everyone, and it costs something for everyone. And it also will look different for everyone, you know. In the past year, I've been working on a project that will eventually be like a audio documentary or podcast series that has been interviews with Christians who experience gender discordance. And what has struck me, the more I talk to people like sexual minorities or gender minorities, is how different each experience is and how unique each experience is. And the people I've talked to have, you know, one of the kind of common themes maybe among these stories is this bringing the whole self to God and being completely seen by God in a way. And so I think there are always like parts of ourselves that we want to hide from God, or that we think we can't bring to God, or that we have to leave behind. But I think the kind of surrender that I'm talking about is one that is a truly kind of integrating of the whole self. It's not one where, again, like we're annihilated, right? Anyway, I mentioned that just to say that I've been very moved by hearing how God works in the hearts in unique ways of people with all kinds of experiences. And it is, you can't universalize from just one person's experience like my own, but I do think that God is wooing every heart, you know, and he wants to dwell with us, to dwell in every heart, yeah, no matter what our experiences are.
That's a beautiful way to end, I think, probably. Don't you think, everybody? Yeah. So let's have a moment of silence and just reflect on what we've heard. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. And please make yourselves at home. You can take a little baggie with you if there's any food left, but please hang out and have a coffee or some cocoa. And let's show our appreciation for a great talk.